A racist cop slaps a black judge, a moment so shocking it destroys his career in an instant. Officer Luke Harris's impulsive act of violence against Judge Ethan Carter didn't just cost him his badge, it unleashed a chain of events that exposed corruption, shattered loyalties, and forced a community to confront its deepest divisions. Find out in this gripping tale of power, prejudice, and reconciliation. Don't forget to share where you're watching from, and subscribe to
our channel so you won't miss more stories that will inspire and challenge you. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with tension as Judge Ethan Carter prepared to deliver his verdict. Opposite him sat Sergeant David Barnes, his expression a mask of cold defiance. Behind Barnes, rows of uniformed officers filled the
gallery, their rigid postures and hardened gazes making it clear where their loyalties lay. On the other side of the aisle, the victim's family clutched one another, their eyes full of hope and fear. Ethan's voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. After reviewing the evidence presented, this court finds Sergeant David Barnes guilty of excessive force and the violation of civil rights. Gasps rippled through the gallery, followed by a cacophony of protests. A group of officers in the back stood abruptly, their faces contorted with anger. "This is a disgrace," one shouted, his voice reverberating through the chamber. "Order," Ethan demanded, slamming his gavel with enough force to echo off the walls. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence, though the tension was palpable. As an officer of the law, Ethan continued, his voice steady but firm. "Your duty was to protect and serve. Instead, you abused that power. This court cannot and will not condone such behavior." He locked eyes with Barnes. "You are sentenced to 5 years in prison." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. One officer muttered something under his breath, and another spat on the floor as they stormed out. The gallery erupted again, forcing the bailiffs to step in. Ethan remained composed, though the weight of the moment pressed heavily on him. Barnes stood, his handcuffed wrists clinking against each other. He turned his icy gaze on Ethan, his voice low and menacing. "You think this is over?" His lips curled into a sneer. "You'll pay for this. Mark my words." The victim's family gasped audibly, while Ethan met Barnes's glare, without flinching. "Threats will not change the facts, Sergeant Barnes. Justice has spoken." Barnes was escorted out by 2 bailiffs, though his words lingered in the judge's mind. Ethan watched him leave, his expression unreadable. As the courtroom emptied, the murmurs of dissent among the officers grew louder in the hallways. "This is a witch hunt," one said angrily. "Barnes didn't deserve this. He's trying to make an example out of us," another chimed in. The murmur turned into an uproar as a group of officers confronted Ethan in the corridor. "Judge Carter," one barked, his fist clenched, "you've turned your back on the people who keep this city safe." Ethan stopped in his tracks, his security detail stepping between him and the officers. He addressed them with calm authority. "Upholding the law means ensuring accountability. No one is above justice, not even those with a badge." The officers didn't back down, their hostility simmering. One pointed a finger at Ethan. "You're gonna regret this," he growled before being pulled away by a colleague. Ethan's security detail ushered him out of the courthouse and into a waiting car. As they drove away, protesters and supporters gathered outside. Some cheered for the verdict, while others held signs denouncing Ethan as anti-police. The chants followed him as the car pulled onto the street, the sound a chaotic blend of anger and approval. Ethan stared out the window, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to exhale. Justice had been served, but the battle was far from over. As the courthouse disappeared from view, Ethan couldn't shake the image of Barnes's venomous glare. He knew the verdict would ripple far beyond the courtroom, but he hadn't yet grasped just how dangerous the coming storm would be. The slam of the car door echoed as Ethan Carter stepped onto his driveway. The tension of the day still clung to him, but the sight of his house, a beacon of normalcy, offered brief solace. His side, the faint murmur of the evening news mingled with the scratching of pen on paper as his son, Noah, worked on homework at the kitchen table. Sophia greeted Ethan in the hallway, her arms crossed, her expression tight. "How was it?" she asked, though the clipped tone suggested she already knew. Ethan sighed as he hung up his coat. "The verdict was delivered. It's done. It's not done." Sophia shot back, her voice low but sharp. "You saw the crowd outside. You heard the threats. This isn't over, Ethan." Before he could respond, Noah looked up from his books, concern etched across his young face. "Dad, I saw some of it on TV. They looked angry." Ethan moved to his son, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes doing what's right makes people angry, Noah. But that doesn't mean we stop doing it." Sophia scoffed, the sound cutting through the room. "And what about us, Ethan? What about the people who have to live with the consequences of your decisions? You're not the only one they're targeting. The tension in the room was palpable. Ethan turned to his wife, his voice measured but firm. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't worry every second about what this means for you, for Noah? Then why not let someone else fight this fight?" Sophia pressed, her eyes blazing. "We're being dragged into a war that's not ours to fight, because if everyone thought like that, there'd be no justice." Ethan countered, his tone rising. "This isn't just about Barnes. It's about what's right." Before Sophia could respond, Noah interrupted, his voice timid. "Mom, Dad, there's a car outside." Both parents turned to him sharply. "What?" Ethan asked, already moving toward the window. Noah pointed toward the driveway. "It's been there for a while. Someone's in it, and I think they're taking pictures." Ethan parted the curtain slightly, his stomach tightening at the sight of the dark sedan parked across the street. The faint glow of a phone screen illuminated the silhouette of a person inside. "Stay here," he ordered, grabbing his phone. Sophia followed him, her voice tense. "What are you doing?" "I'm calling the police," Ethan replied, dialing quickly. "This isn't just coincidence." As he explained the situation to the dispatcher, the sedan's headlights suddenly flared to life. The engine roared, and the car sped away, its tires screeching as it disappeared into the night. "They're gone," Ethan muttered, lowering the phone. Sophia's voice trembled with anger and fear. "This is what I was talking about. They're watching us now, Ethan. This isn't just threats anymore. It's real." Ethan faced her, his expression resolute. "And what do you want me to do, Sophia? Back down? Let them think they can intimidate us into silence?" "Yes," she snapped, tears welling in her eyes. "If it means keeping this family safe, then yes, Ethan, I want you to back down. I want you to choose us for once." Noah stood in the doorway, his gaze bouncing between his parents, his anxiety growing with each word. Ethan's voice softened as he looked at Sophia. "I am choosing us. By standing up now, I'm making sure people like Barnes don't get away with this again. For Noah's future, for all of ours." Sophia shook her head, her voice breaking. "How do I protect Noah from what's coming, Ethan? How do I protect myself?" "You won't have to," Ethan said, stepping closer. "I'll protect you. That's my job." She looked away, her shoulders trembling. "You can't promise that." Ethan wanted to argue, but the truth in her words silenced him. The weight of his choices pressed down harder than ever. From the doorway, Noah finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "Dad, what if they come back?" Ethan crouched down to meet his son's eyes. "Then we'll be ready, and we'll face it together." As the Carter family braced themselves for the threats ahead, the turmoil within the police, in the dimly lit break room of the 7th Precinct, a group of officers huddled close, their voices low but sharp. Sergeant David Barnes, temporarily freed on bail, stood at the center of the group, his commanding presence demanding attention. "We've been thrown under the bus," Barnes growled, his voice dripping with venom. "All of us. And it's because of that damn judge." The room murmured in agreement, heads nodding as Barnes scanned the faces around him. "Carter thinks he can sit on his high horse and destroy everything we built, but we're not going to let him." Officer Luke Harris leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, eyes fixed on the floor. He'd worked with Barnes for years and respected his leadership, but the tone in Barnes's voice made his stomach turn. "What's the plan, Sarge?" one officer asked, eager for direction. Barnes's lips curled into a sinister smile. "We make his life hell. Surveillance, intimidation, whatever it takes to show him he made a mistake messing with us. His family isn't off limits either. People need to learn that crossing us has consequences." Luke straightened at those words, his jaw tightening. "Hold up," he interrupted. The room turned to him. "You're talking about going after his family? That's crossing a line." Barnes turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. "You got a problem, Harris." I do," Luke said firmly, stepping forward. "This isn't about protecting the badge anymore. This is personal. You're dragging us into something that'll ruin us all." An older officer, Officer Dean, stepped between them, his voice tense. "Watch your mouth, Harris. Barnes is doing what's necessary to protect this department." "Necessary?" Luke shot back. "Stalking a judge and threatening his kid, that's necessary. Since when is that what we stand for?" The tension in the room was suffocating. Barnes stepped closer to Luke, their faces inches apart. "Since they decided we're the enemy," Barnes hissed, "this isn't just about Carter. It's about sending a message to anyone who thinks they can tear us down." Luke shook his head. "You're blinded by your own anger, Dave. This isn't justice, it's revenge." Barnes's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You're either with us or against us, Harris. And you know what happens to traitors." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Luke glanced around, his frustration mounting. as he realized how many of his colleagues were willing to follow Barnes's lead without question. "Count me out," Luke said, his voice steady despite the fire in his chest. "I'm not part of this." Barnes smirked. "That's a shame, but if you're not with us, you're nothing." He gestured toward the door. "Get out." Luke didn't hesitate. He pushed past the group, his footsteps heavy as he left the room. The moment he stepped into the hallway, he felt the weight of their stares and whispers behind him. That evening, Ethan Carter's phone buzzed with a message from Noah. It was a photo of graffiti scrawled across the family's garage door. "Traitor." Ethan clenched his fists, his mind racing. Before he could respond, Sophia called out from the living room. "Ethan, come here." When he entered, she pointed to the television. The local news was running a story about a car tailing Noah as he left school, with footage submitted by a concerned citizen. "They're escalating," Sophia said, her voice shaking. "This isn't just threats anymore." Ethan nodded grimly. "I'll handle it." Luke sat in his car outside the precinct, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He'd spent his career believing in the integrity of the badge, but now it felt like a lie. As he opened the door to step out, Officer Dean appeared, leaning against a nearby patrol car. "That was brave, Harris," Dean said sarcastically, lighting a cigarette. "Sticking your neck out like that." Luke approached cautiously. "What do you want, Dean?" "Just a friendly warning," Dean replied, exhaling smoke. "Barnes doesn't forgive, and he sure as hell doesn't forget. You'd better watch your back." Luke's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. The precinct buzzed with activity the next day, but Luke felt like a ghost as he walked through the hallways. The tension was thick, and every glance in his direction was cold. In the locker room, Barnes cornered him. "You think you're better than us now?" He sneered. "I think you've lost sight of what's right," Luke shot back. "And I'm not going down with you." Barnes's fist slammed into the locker beside Luke's head, the sound reverberating through the room. "Careful, Harris. You're making enemies you can't afford." Luke stood his ground, his voice low but firm. "I'm done being afraid of you, Dave." Barnes stepped back, his eyes narrowing. "Then you're done, period." As Barnes's vendetta against Ethan intensifies, Luke's defiance sets the stage for a confrontation neither man can avoid. Their paths are destined to collide in the most public way possible. The doorbell of May's Diner jingled as Officer Luke Harris entered, his expression hard and unyielding. The usual hum of quiet conversations and clinking cutlery stilled as patrons noticed his presence. Luke's eyes immediately landed on Ryan Johnson, a young black man sitting at the counter, scrolling on his phone while waiting for his food. Luke approached Ryan, his boots heavy on the floor. "ID," he said curtly, standing too close. Ryan looked up, confused. "I'm sorry, what?" "ID," Luke repeated, his tone sharper. "Let's see it." "I haven't done anything," Ryan replied, his voice calm but tinged with caution. "I'm just here waiting for my order." Luke's jaw tightened. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for. Show me your ID, or I'll have to take you in for questioning." The tension in the diner thickened. Sally, the elderly waitress behind the counter, hesitated before speaking. "Officer Harris, Ryan's here almost every week. He's no trouble." Luke ignored her, his hand hovering near his belt. "ID, now." Ryan reached into his pocket and handed over his driver's license. "Here, but you're making a mistake." Luke barely glanced at it before stepping closer. "Stand up." "Why?" Ryan asked, his patience thinning. "Don't argue with me." Luke grabbed Ryan's arm and yanked him to his feet. "Hey," Ryan protested, pulling back slightly. "You're out of line." The scuffle caught the attention of Judge Ethan Carter, sitting in a corner booth. He had been trying to enjoy a quiet meal, but the escalating scene drew his focus. Ethan rose, his presence commanding the room's attention. "That's enough," Ethan said firmly, stepping between Luke and Ryan. "Officer Harris, what exactly is this man being detained for?" Luke glared at Ethan. "Stay out of this, Carter. It's police business." Ethan didn't flinch. "As a judge, I have every right to ensure proper procedure is followed. You have no grounds to detain him." Luke's grip on Ryan tightened, his frustration boiling over. "You think you can lecture me about the law? You don't know what it's like out there." "Let him go," Ethan demanded, his tone sharp. Ryan seized the moment to speak. "I've done nothing wrong. This is harassment." Luke shoved Ryan against the counter with enough force to make the utensils rattle. The room gasped. "You need to shut your mouth," Luke barked. "Stop." Ethan's voice rang out, cutting through the tension like a blade. "This is an abuse of power, and it ends now." The room fell silent as Luke turned toward Ethan, his face red with fury. "Don't tell me how to do my job." Ethan stood his ground. "I'm telling you that your behavior is unacceptable. If you don't release him, I'll report this incident myself. That was the breaking point. In a flash of unbridled anger, Luke's hand lashed out, striking Ethan across the face with an audible crack. The collective gasp from the diners was deafening. Ethan stumbled back a step but quickly steadied himself, his hand touching his reddened cheek. "Oh my God," someone whispered. "That's Judge Carter." Another patron murmured, pulling out a phone. The silence was shattered by the sound of clicking cameras and recording phones. Luke froze, his chest heaving as the weight of his actions sank in. Ethan straightened, his voice calm but resolute. "You just assaulted a federal judge. Step away now, Officer Harris." Luke's face contorted, a mixture of defiance and regret flashing in his eyes. Ryan used the distraction to move away, standing beside Sally behind the counter. The doorbell jingled again as 3 officers, known allies of Barnes, entered the diner. They quickly assessed the situation and approached Ethan with menacing confidence. "You need to leave, Carter," one of them said, his tone low and threatening. "You're out of your depth here." The patrons began to murmur louder, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others standing in solidarity. "I'm not going anywhere," Ethan replied. "You've all just witnessed an officer abuse his authority and commit assault. This will be reported." One of the officers stepped closer, his hand resting on his belt. "Be smart, Judge. You don't want this to escalate." Before anyone could respond, a young woman in the back called out, "We're recording all of this." Several other diners raised their phones, the flashing red lights of active recording sending a clear message. The officers hesitated, their confidence wavering under the scrutiny of the public. "You think this is over?" Luke growled, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked him in the eye, his voice steady. "No, it's just beginning." The officers exchanged glances before retreating, muttering under their breaths as they left the diner. Luke lingered for a moment, his anger still simmering, but the weight of the stares and phones pointed at him forced him to follow his colleagues out the door. The room erupted in a flurry of voices as the tension broke. Ryan looked at Ethan, his gratitude evident. "Thank you, Judge Carter. I didn't think anyone would step in." "You shouldn't have to feel that way," Ethan replied. That evening, the video of Luke slapping Ethan went viral, sparking outrage and intense debate. For Luke, the fallout was immediate and brutal, and his family bore the brunt of the backlash. The incident marked the start of an unraveling, both personal and systemic. The front door slammed behind Luke Harris as he stormed into his home. His face was flushed, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. The day's events replayed in his mind. The slap, the flashing cameras, the cold judgment in Ethan Carter's eyes. "Luke," Chloe's voice rang out from the living room, sharp and unforgiving. She stood with her arms crossed, her phone clutched tightly in one hand. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Luke stopped short, his shoulders heaving. "I don't need this right now, Chloe." "You don't need this?" Chloe's voice rose, her anger palpable. "Do you know how many calls I've gotten today? How many messages? That video is everywhere, Luke. My coworkers saw it. Maggie's friends saw it. The whole world knows what you did." "I didn't start this," Luke snapped, throwing his keys onto the counter. "That judge humiliated Barnes. He's tearing us apart." Chloe took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "Don't you dare try to justify this. You slapped a judge in public, Luke, in front of cameras. How can you not see how wrong that is?" "He deserved it," Luke spat, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. "He's making it impossible for us to do our jobs. He doesn't know what it's like out there." "What it's like out there?" Chloe's tone turned icy. "Do you even hear yourself? You sound like some angry thug, not the man I married." Luke's fists clenched at his sides. "You don't understand. None of you do." From the hallway a soft voice cut through the tension. "We don't understand because you won't explain, Dad." Both parents turned to see Maggie, their 16-year-old daughter, standing in the doorway. Her eyes were red-rimmed and her hands trembled as she clutched her phone. "Everyone at school is talking about it," Maggie said, her voice cracking. "Do you know what it's like to have people whispering about your dad? Calling him a monster?" "Maggie, Luke started, but she cut him off. "No, I don't want to hear it," she cried. "You keep saying you're protecting us, but all you're doing is ruining everything." Luke took a step toward her, his voice softening. "Maggie, listen to me. I'm doing this for you." "For me?" Maggie interrupted, her tone bitter. "You think I want this? I hate what you're doing. I hate what you've become." Her words struck like a physical blow. Luke reached out, but Maggie stepped back, tears streaming down her face. "I can't be here right now. "Maggie, wait," Chloe began, but the girl had already grabbed her jacket and thus stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. Luke turned to Chloe, his voice breaking. "She'll come back. She just needs time." Chloe shook her head, her expression a mix of anger and sorrow. "You don't get it, do you? You've pushed her away. You've pushed all of us away." "Don't put this on me," Luke shouted. "None of this would have happened if Carter hadn't gone after Barnes. He's the one tearing everything apart." "No, Luke," Chloe said, her voice cold. "This is on you. Your anger, your ego, your inability to let go of a fight that isn't worth it. You've destroyed this family." Hours later, Luke sat alone in the dimly lit living room, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the coffee table. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling. He stared at the television, muted but displaying the now infamous diner video on loop. A knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. He staggered to his feet and opened it to find 3 officers, Barnes's staunchest supporters, standing on his porch. "What do you want?" Luke asked, his voice slurred. One of them, a burly man named Officer Dean, stepped forward. "We need to talk." "Not now," Luke muttered, starting to close the door, but Dean shoved it open with a meaty hand. "This isn't optional, Harris," Dean growled, stepping inside. The other 2 followed, their faces set with grim determination. Luke stumbled back, his eyes narrowing. "What the hell is this?" Dean folded his arms. "You screwed up today, but you can still fix it. Show everyone you're not backing down. Take back your honor." "What are you talking about?" Luke asked, though a knot of dread was forming in his gut. Another officer, a wiry man named Calloway, spoke up. "We're going to send Carter a message. A real one this time." Luke's head snapped up. "No, absolutely not." Dean stepped closer, his voice low and threatening. "You don't have a choice. You're either with us or you're against us. And if you're against us, well, you know what happens to traitors." Luke stared at them, his fists clenching. "I'm not doing this. I'm not dragging my family any deeper into this mess." "Your family?" Calloway sneered. "You think Carter cares about your family? He's the reason your daughter's crying and your wife's ready to walk out." Dean nodded. "This is your chance to make it right. You want to be the man they respect again? Or are you just going to let Carter keep destroying you?" Luke's mind raced. He hated Carter, but he hated what he'd become even more. "Get out," he said through gritted teeth. Dean smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Have it your way, Harris. Just remember, no one's coming to save you when this all falls apart." The 3 officers left, slamming the door behind them. Luke stood in the silence, his heart pounding. As Luke grappled with his crumbling family and the threat from within, Ethan Carter was about to face a danger that would push the conflict to a breaking point. The late-night stillness in the courthouse parking lot was broken only by the hum of distant traffic. Ethan Carter walked briskly to his car, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. The lot was sparsely lit, leaving deep shadows between the rows of vehicles. As he approached his sedan, a faint scuffling noise behind him made him pause. He turned, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Shaking off the unease, he continued toward his car, his pace quickening. The noise came again, closer this time. Footsteps, deliberate. Ethan stopped abruptly, his hand instinctively moving to his pocket for his phone. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice firm but edged with tension. Silence. Ethan turned back toward his car, but the faint reflection in the side mirror froze him. A figure was moving fast, closing the distance. Without thinking, Ethan bolted. His shoes slapped against the pavement as he sprinted between parked cars, his breath coming in sharp bursts. Behind him, heavy footfalls echoed, closing in. "Carter!" a deep voice barked, sending a chill down his spine. Ethan didn't stop. He weaved through the rows of vehicles, the adrenaline surging through him, as he made a beeline for the lot's exit. The attacker wasn't far behind, his grunts audible with every step. A sudden pain exploded in Ethan's shoulder as something hard struck him from behind. He stumbled, crashing to the ground with a groan. He twisted to see a man towering over him, a metal pipe clutched tightly in his gloved hands. "You think you can ruin lives and walk away?" the man growled, raising the pipe again. Ethan rolled to the side just in time, the pipe slamming into the asphalt with a sharp clang. He kicked out, his foot connecting with the attacker's knee, causing him to stagger. Scrambling to his feet, Ethan lunged toward his car, fumbling for his key fob. The attacker was on him again, grabbing his arm and swinging the pipe toward his ribs. Ethan twisted, the blow glancing off his side but sending him sprawling against the car. Through the haze of pain, Ethan hit the panic button on his key fob. The car's alarm blared, the headlights flashing like a strobe. The attacker flinched at the sudden noise, giving Ethan the split-second opening he needed. He grabbed at the man's jacket, his fingers catching the fabric near the pocket. With a desperate yank, he tore a piece of the jacket away, sending the attacker reeling backward. Ethan didn't wait. He threw open the car door, climbed inside and locked it. The attacker banged on the window with the pipe, but the sound of approaching voices, drawn by the alarm, made him pause. "You'll regret this," the man hissed before turning and vanishing into the shadows. Ethan sat in the driver's seat, his chest heaving, his shoulder throbbed and his ribs ached, but his focus was on the torn piece of fabric in his hand. In the dim light of the flashing headlights, he spotted a small badge sewn into the fabric's interior, a police department insignia. Back inside the courthouse, Ethan sat in a chair, his jacket off to reveal a forming bruise on his shoulder. Detective Emma Blake stood nearby, examining the torn fabric he had handed over. "You're sure this came from him?" Emma asked, her tone sharp. Ethan nodded, his voice steady despite the lingering adrenaline. "I tore it off during the struggle." He had a police badge sewn into his jacket. "Whoever this is, they're connected to Barnes." Emma frowned, holding the fabric up to the light. "This is incriminating. If this guy's on the force, we'll find out who he is." "They're escalating," Ethan said, leaning forward. "This isn't just intimidation anymore. They're willing to attack in the open." Emma met his gaze, her expression resolute. "Then it's time we hit back. Hard." The evidence in hand, Emma begins to unravel the conspiracy within the department, drawing a direct line back to Barnes and setting the stage for deeper revelations and conflicts. Luke Harris sat in his car outside a dingy bar where Barnes and his loyalists often gathered. His hands tightened around the steering wheel as he stared at the glowing neon sign. Inside that building, he knew decisions were being made. Decisions that would harm Ethan Carter, and perhaps even his family. Luke had spent sleepless nights replaying the events at the diner, the fallout with his family, and the mounting evidence of Barnes's reckless vendetta. He had defended Barnes for years, turning a blind eye to questionable tactics. But this was different. This was criminal. "Enough," he muttered to himself, grabbing a small digital recorder from the glove compartment. He slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, his heart pounding as he opened the car door. Inside the bar's back room, Barnes stood at the head of a table, surrounded by his most loyal officers. Empty beer bottles littered the surface, and the air was thick with smoke and tension. Luke entered quietly, drawing a few suspicious glances. "Glad you could make it, Harris," Barnes said, his tone laced with sarcasm. "I wasn't sure you still had the stomach for this." Luke ignored the jab and sat near the end of the table, his face unreadable. "What's the plan, Dave?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. Barnes smirked. "The plan is to remind Carter who he's messing with. Last night was a warning. Next time, he won't be so lucky." Luke tensed but kept his expression calm. "What do you mean, next time? You're talking about escalating this?" Barnes leaned forward, his voice lowering to a growl. "You think we can just let him walk all over us? He's out there dragging our names through the mud, making a mockery of everything we stand for." "What we stand for?" Luke shot back, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Since when does what we stand for include attacking a judge in a parking lot, or terrorizing his family?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Luke. Barnes's smirk disappeared, replaced by a steely glare. "Watch your mouth, Harris." "No, you watch yours," Luke said, his voice rising. "You're dragging us down with this. Every time you lash out, you're proving Carter right. You're making us look like thugs." Barnes slammed his fist on the table, the bottles rattling. Don't lecture me, Harris. I'm protecting this department, protecting all of you, while Carter's out there trying to dismantle everything we've built. You're not protecting anyone, Luke retorted. You're destroying us. And for what? Your pride? Your grudge against Carter? Barnes stood abruptly, towering over Luke. You've got a lot of nerve coming in here and questioning me. After everything I've done for you, for all of us, you think you can just walk in here and preach? I'm questioning you because someone has to, Luke fired back, standing to meet Barnes's glare. This isn't loyalty, it's madness. You're going to get someone killed. Barnes stepped closer, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. Be careful, Harris. You don't want to cross the line. We look out for each other, but there's no room for traitors. Luke held his ground, though his pulse raced. Maybe you should look in the mirror, Dave, because right now the only traitor I see is you. Barnes stared at Luke for a long, tense moment before turning his attention back to the group. We stick to the plan, he said sharply. The message needs to be loud and clear. Nobody messes with us and gets away with it. As Barnes continued, Luke discreetly pressed a button on the recorder inside his jacket. Every word Barnes spoke was damning. The judge is a liability, Barnes growled. We've got the resources to take care of him for good if it comes to that. We just need to make sure he gets the message loud and clear. Luke's stomach turned, but he kept his expression blank. He knew the risk he was taking. If Barnes or anyone else in the room discovered what he was doing, there would be no turning back. The meeting finally ended, and Luke slipped out of the bar unnoticed. His hands trembled as he climbed into his car and replayed the recording. Barnes's voice filled the silence, every word more incriminating than the last. Luke drove straight to the courthouse, his mind racing. He had crossed the line Barnes warned him about, but he knew it was the only way to put an end to the chaos. Ethan Carter sat at his desk, the bruises from the parking lot attack still visible. When his office door opened, he looked up to see Luke standing there, his face pale but determined. What do you want? Ethan asked, his tone wary. Luke stepped inside and closed the door behind him. I have something you need to hear. Nick, he pulled the recorder from his jacket and placed it on the desk. Ethan stared at it for a moment before pressing play. As Barnes's voice filled the room, Ethan's expression shifted from suspicion to grim understanding. When the recording ended, he looked at Luke. This is dangerous, Ethan said. You know that, right? Luke nodded. I know, but it's the truth, and it needs to come out. Why now? Ethan asked, his gaze piercing. Because I've had enough, Luke admitted. I've been part of the problem for too long. It's time to fix it, even if it costs me everything. Ethan studied him for a long moment before nodding. This could be the key to bringing Barnes down. With the evidence in hand, Ethan and Detective Emma Blake prepare to confront Barnes, setting off a chain reaction that will shake the department to its core. The roar of the crowd outside the courthouse was deafening. Hundreds of protesters filled the street, divided into two camps. On one side, supporters of Ethan Carter held signs demanding accountability and justice, their chants echoing, "No one is above the law." Across the barricade, loyalists of Sergeant David Barnes waved banners proclaiming, "Protect our police." The air was thick with tension, the sharp smell of sweat and anger mingling with the fumes from idling police vehicles. Officers in riot gear formed a shaky line between the opposing sides, their shields glinting under the midday sun. Ethan stood by a window in his office watching the chaos unfold below. Detective Emma Blake was beside him, her jaw tight. "This is getting out of control," she said, her voice edged with concern. Ethan nodded grimly. "It's only a matter of time before someone gets hurt." A bottle sailed through the air, shattering against the pavement between the two groups. The sound was a signal. Suddenly fists flew, and both sides surged forward. "Stay back!" a riot officer barked, raising his shield as projectiles rained down. Bottles, cans, even chunks of concrete. A woman on Ethan's side screamed as she was shoved to the ground. A group of Barnes loyalists advanced, pushing through the barricade and tackling protesters. The riot police waded in, wielding batons to separate the clashing groups. But their presence only fueled the chaos. Ethan turned to Emma. "We have to do something. This can't go on." "You step out there, and you'll be a target," Emma warned. "They're already targeting me," Ethan said, grabbing his coat. If I don't step up now, who will? Ethan pushed through the courthouse doors and stepped onto the front steps. The scene before him was chaos. Protesters and counter-protesters shouting, fighting and scattering as police struggled to contain the violence. A can of paint flew in Ethan's direction, splattering red streaks across the marble steps. He didn't flinch. Enough! Ethan's voice boomed through the megaphone he carried. His presence caught the attention of the crowd, their shouting momentarily quieting as they turned toward him. "You're not helping anyone with this," Ethan said, his voice resolute. "We're here to demand justice, not to tear each other apart." A man from Barnes' side shouted, "You're the reason this is happening, Carter. You're the problem." The crowd began to rumble again, the tension threatening to boil over. Then Luke Harris emerged from the courthouse, stepping beside Ethan. His uniform, once a symbol of his authority, now felt like a weight around his shoulders. The crowd's reaction was instant. Shouts of "traitor" erupted from Barnes' supporters, while Ethan's side looked on in confusion. Luke raised his hands, his voice cutting through the noise. "Listen to me." The shouting subsided slightly as the crowd strained to hear him. "I've made mistakes," Luke admitted, his voice raw. "I've let my anger cloud my judgment, and I've hurt people because of it. But what's happening here? This isn't about justice or loyalty, it's just more hate." A bottle hurled from Barnes' side narrowly missed Luke's head, smashing on the steps behind him. He didn't flinch. "Ethan Carter isn't your enemy," Luke continued, turning to face Barnes' supporters. "The enemy is corruption, it's abuse of power, and I'm done being part of it." The silence that followed was heavy. On Ethan's side, people began clapping, their voices rising in support. But Barnes' side erupted into furious shouts, calling Luke a traitor and a liar. "You sold us out," a man yelled, throwing a rock that struck Luke's shoulder. He staggered but didn't fall. "I'm standing up for what's right," Luke said, his voice steady despite the pain. "And deep down, you all know that's what we should be doing." Ethan stepped forward again, addressing both sides. "This isn't about taking sides. This is about accountability. If we want a better future, we have to stop tearing each other apart and start holding the right people responsible." A young woman from Barnes' side hesitated, lowering her sign. Slowly she stepped forward, crossing the barricade. "He's right," she said, her voice trembling. "This isn't justice." Her action emboldened others. More protesters from Barnes' side began dropping their banners and stepping back, their anger giving way to uncertainty. The tide was turning, but not everyone was ready to stand down. A man in the back yelled, "Don't listen to them. They'll sell us out to the system." He charged forward, but riot police intercepted him, pinning him to the ground. Ethan used the moment to press on. "We can fix this. Together. But it starts with us stopping this madness, right here, right now." As the tension in the crowd eased, the riot police began dispersing the remaining agitators. The courthouse steps were littered with debris, but the violence had finally ebbed. Luke stood beside Ethan, his uniform streaked with paint, and his shoulder aching from the thrown rock. "That was reckless," he said to Ethan. "So was this," Ethan replied, gesturing to the crowd. "But sometimes you have to take the risk." Luke nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. The protest became a pivotal moment, with video footage of Ethan and Luke's actions spreading across media outlets. It fueled the push to bring Barnes to justice, signaling the final steps in their battle. The courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and officers. The buzz of murmurs filled the air as Sergeant David Barnes sat at the defendant's table, his face a mask of defiance. His lawyer, Richard Morgan, exuded confidence, a slight smirk playing at his lips as he reviewed his notes. Across the room, Ethan Carter sat beside Detective Emma Blake, his gaze fixed on Barnes. Luke Harris was at a separate bench, his expression grim but resolute. The judge entered and the room fell silent. "This court is now in session," the clerk announced. The prosecutor, Marissa Hayes, rose to address the jury. Her voice was steady and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not just about one man's actions. It's about the systemic abuse of power. Sergeant Barnes used his authority to intimidate, harm, and silence those who stood in his way. Today we will show you the evidence that proves his guilt beyond a shadow of a doubt." Morgan stood next, his tone smooth but cutting. The prosecution will try to paint my client as a villain. But what they won't tell you is the truth. Sergeant Barnes is a scapegoat. A man who dedicated his life to protecting the city is being punished for doing his job. The evidence they'll present is circumstantial at best. The first witnesses called were victims of Barnes's intimidation tactics. A shop owner testified about threats made after he filed a complaint against Barnes for harassment. A young man described being wrongfully arrested and beaten by officers under Barnes's orders. Each testimony chipped away at Barnes's defense. But Morgan's cross-examinations were brutal, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Isn't it true," he asked the shop owner, "that you have a history of run-ins with law enforcement?" The shop owner's voice faltered. "That doesn't make what he did right." "No further questions," Morgan said with a satisfied nod. When Ethan was called to testify, the tension in the room became palpable. "Judge Carter," Hayes began, "can you describe the events leading up to the parking lot attack?" Ethan recounted the incident in detail, his voice steady. "I was leaving work when I noticed someone following me. He attacked me with a metal pipe, and during the struggle, I managed to tear a piece of fabric from his jacket. That fabric contained a police insignia." Morgan stood ready to pounce. "Judge Carter, you claim the attacker was linked to Sergeant Barnes, but did you see his face?" "No," Ethan admitted. "So you can't definitively say my client was involved?" Morgan pressed, his tone triumphant. Ethan met his gaze evenly. "Not directly, but the evidence, including Sergeant Barnes's own words on a recording, will make his involvement clear." The courtroom grew even quieter when Luke took the stand. His uniform was gone, replaced by a plain suit, but the weight of his badge still seemed to hang over him. "Officer Harris," Hayes began, "you were part of Sergeant Barnes's inner circle. Can you tell the court what you witnessed?" Luke took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edges of the witness stand. "I was loyal to Barnes. For years I believed we were doing the right thing, protecting our own. But that loyalty blinded me to the harm we were causing. I saw him order intimidation tactics against Judge Carter. I heard him justify violence against civilians. And I stayed silent." "Why did you stay silent?" Hayes asked. "Fear," Luke admitted, his voice cracking. "Fear of what would happen if I didn't. But that changed when I saw how far Barnes was willing to go." Hayes nodded. "And did Sergeant Barnes ever directly discuss harming Judge Carter?" "Yes," Luke said firmly. "In a meeting, he said the judge was a liability and needed to be dealt with. That meeting was recorded." Gas rippled through the courtroom. Hayes approached the evidence table, holding the digital recorder. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit this recording into evidence." The judge nodded. "Proceed." The recording played, Barnes's voice echoing through the courtroom. "The judge is a liability. We've got the resources to take care of him for good if it comes to that. We just need to make sure he gets the message loud and clear." The damning words hung in the air. Barnes shifted uncomfortably, his lawyer whispering furiously in his ear. When the recording ended, Hayes turned to the jury. "This is not the voice of a man protecting his city. This is the voice of a man abusing his power to destroy anyone who opposes him." Morgan stood, trying to spin the narrative. "That recording doesn't prove intent. It could be interpreted in a number of ways." Hayes shot back. "The jury has ears. They know exactly what they heard." After days of testimony and evidence, the case came to a close. Hayes delivered her final argument with conviction. "This trial is about accountability. Sergeant Barnes used his badge as a shield for his crimes. Today you have the power to say enough is enough." Morgan's closing was equally impassioned. "This trial is a witch hunt, built on circumstantial evidence, and the testimony of a man trying to save his own skin." He gestured to Luke. "Don't let this betrayal cloud your judgment." The jury deliberated for hours. When they returned, the atmosphere in the room was electric. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit assault, we find the defendant, David Barnes, guilty." Cheers erupted from Ethan's supporters, while Barnes's allies sat in stunned silence. The judge called for order as Barnes was led away in handcuffs, his face a mix of rage and disbelief. The trial's outcome ignited a movement for reform, led by Ethan and Luke, as the city began to reckon with the systemic failures that allowed Barnes's corruption to thrive. The Carter Harris Community Center buzzed with energy on its opening day. Volunteers bustled about, setting up chairs, arranging flyers, and greeting attendees. Children laughed in the background as a group of teens prepared a presentation on conflict resolution. Ethan Carter stood at the front of the auditorium, flanked by Luke Harris. The two men, once bitter adversaries, now shared a vision: rebuilding trust between the police and the community. Ethan adjusted the microphone and cleared his throat as the crowd settled. "This center represents more than just a building," Ethan began. "It's a promise to listen, to learn, and to work together toward a better future." The crowd erupted in applause, but not everyone was celebrating. Outside, a few police officers loyal to Barnes lingered, their faces tight with anger. "This place is a joke," one muttered. "It's nothing but a symbol of betrayal." Unbeknownst to Ethan and Luke, the disgruntled officers had been plotting for weeks. They saw the center as a direct attack on their authority, a rallying point for those who wanted to dismantle the power they wielded unchecked. That night, under the cover of darkness, the group struck. They pried open a side door of the center and crept inside with crowbars and spray paint. "Let's make sure they remember who's in charge," one of them said, smashing a table with a single swing. They moved quickly, ripping down posters and smashing equipment. One officer sprayed the words, "Traitors die," across the main wall in bold, jagged letters. Meanwhile, Luke Harris had stayed late to lock up, joined by Ethan's son, Noah, and a few teenage volunteers. They were cleaning up the supply room when the sound of breaking glass stopped them cold. "What was that?" Noah whispered, his eyes wide. Luke held up a hand signaling silence. "Stay here," he ordered, grabbing a nearby flashlight. He crept toward the main hall, his heart pounding as he caught sight of the destruction. Several figures in dark clothing were tearing through the space, their faces partially obscured. "Stop!" Luke's voice rang out, firm and commanding. The intruders froze for a split second before one of them stepped forward. "Harris," the man sneered. "Should have known you'd be here. Still playing the hero, huh?" Luke recognized him, Officer Dean, a longtime ally of Barnes. "This isn't the way, Dean," Luke said, keeping his voice steady. "Whatever you think you're accomplishing, it won't work." Dean laughed bitterly. "You don't get it, do you? This place is an insult to everything we fought for." Luke took a step closer, his flashlight illuminating the graffiti on the wall. "What you're doing here isn't fighting for anything. It's just destruction." Dean's face twisted with anger. "And what you're doing? Selling out your brothers for some feel-good PR?" Another officer lunged forward, shoving Luke back against the table. The teenagers in the supply room heard the commotion and rushed out, despite Luke's earlier warning. "Leave him alone," Noah shouted, standing protectively beside Luke. Dean sneered at the boy. "You've got guts, kid. Too bad you're following the wrong example." "Enough," Luke barked, stepping between Noah and the intruders. His voice carried a weight that made even Dean hesitate. "I've been where you are," Luke said, his tone hard but pleading. "I've let anger and loyalty blind me. But this isn't loyalty, it's cowardice." Dean stepped closer, gripping his crowbar tightly. "Watch your mouth, Harris. You don't want to push me?" Luke didn't flinch. "Go ahead, hit me. But it won't change the fact that what you're doing is wrong. You're not protecting anything. You're just proving everyone's worst fears about us." Dean's grip faltered. The other officers exchanged uneasy glances. Luke pressed on. "I get it. You think you're standing up for something. But this community isn't our enemy. They need us to do better, not tear each other apart." For a moment the room was silent, except for the distant wail of approaching sirens. "We need to go," one of the officers muttered, tugging on Dean's arm. Dean hesitated, his jaw clenched, before finally backing down. "This isn't over, Harris," he spat before storming out with the others. Minutes later, local police arrived to find Luke leaning against the table, clutching his bruised ribs. Ethan and Emma arrived shortly after, their faces a mix of shock and anger as they surveyed the damage. "They were officers," Luke said quietly, his voice laced with frustration. "Barnes's people." Ethan shook his head, his expression grim. "They're trying to break us." "They won't," Luke said firmly, straightening despite the pain. "We'll rebuild. They can't stop this." By morning, news of the attack had spread. Volunteers poured in to help clean up the mess. The graffiti was painted over, broken furniture was replaced, and donations flooded in from community members who refused to let the destruction define them. At a press conference held on the steps of the center, Ethan addressed the crowd. "This attack was meant to divide us," he said, "to make us afraid. But all it's done is prove why this center is so important. We will not be silenced, we will not back down." Luke stood beside him, bandages visible under his shirt. When Ethan handed him the microphone, he hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I was once part of the problem," Luke admitted. "But tonight, I saw something I haven't seen in a long time. People coming together, refusing to give up. That's what real strength looks like. That's what we're fighting for." The attack solidified the center's importance in the eyes of the community. As momentum for reform grew, Ethan and Luke prepared to take their efforts to a larger stage, determined to create lasting change. The Carter Harris Community Center, still bearing faint scars from the recent attack, became a hub of relentless activity. Volunteers worked tirelessly, repainting walls and repairing broken furniture, while others prepared for the day's events. Ethan Carter and Luke Harris stood in one of the main halls, reviewing the schedule. Ethan, ever the strategist, pointed to a bulletin board filled with plans for community dialogues, workshops, and training sessions. "Today's dialogue is key," he said. "If we're going to bridge this divide, we need these conversations to work." Luke nodded, his expression resolute. "I've got the training session covered. Let's hope some of the younger officers show up. They're the ones who can really lead the change." In a modestly decorated meeting room, Ethan stood at the front as rows of chairs filled with a mix of community members and police officers. The tension in the room was palpable. Residents who had felt the brunt of systemic injustice sat across from officers who now found themselves under scrutiny. Ethan began, his voice calm but firm. "We're here to listen to one another, not to argue but to understand. Let's start with a simple question. How has policing affected your life?" A young mother stood, her hands trembling slightly. "My son is 14, she began, her voice breaking. "He's been stopped by police 5 times this year. For walking home from school. He's scared all the time, and I don't know how to protect him." Her words hung heavy in the room. An older officer in the back shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent. Then a young officer stood, his face flushed. "I used to think stopping people like your son was just doing my job," he admitted. "But after attending these sessions, I've realized how much harm those stops cause. I want to do better. I need to do better." The mother's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, her expression softening. Across the room, more hands began to rise as people shared their experiences. Painful stories of discrimination and fear clashed with officers' confessions of missteps and bias. By the end of the session, the tension in the room had eased, replaced by an air of tentative hope. In a nearby training room, Luke stood before a group of officers. A projector displayed a video of a tense police interaction escalating unnecessarily. "This," Luke said, pointing to the screen, "is what we're trying to avoid." He stepped aside as the video paused on an officer reaching for his weapon. "Now let's talk about de-escalation. What could have been done differently here?" A rookie officer raised her hand. He could have kept his hands visible and used calm language instead of shouting. "Exactly," Luke said, nodding. "And what about body language?" Another officer chimed in. "He was too aggressive, leaning forward, invading the person's space." Luke smiled faintly. "Good. These are the things we need to be aware of in real time. Let's run a scenario." He set up a role-playing exercise where one officer acted as a civilian, while another practiced de-escalation techniques. The session was filmed, and later, a clip of Luke guiding the officers through the training was shared on social media. The video gained traction quickly, earning praise for its forward-thinking approach. Meanwhile, Ethan's son Noah and Luke's daughter Maggie were busy organizing a fundraising event for the center. They decorated the auditorium with banners and set up tables filled with baked goods, handmade crafts, and information about the center's programs. As students and their families began arriving, Noah and Maggie took turns at the microphone. Maggie, clutching a note card, spoke with quiet determination. "We can't change the past," she said, her voice carrying across the room, "but we can learn from it. We can build a future where trust and understanding replace fear and division." The crowd erupted into applause. Local reporters captured the moment, and by the next day, images of Noah and Maggie's event were circulating online, drawing even more attention to the center's mission. The Carter Harris Center's efforts were soon featured on major news outlets. A segment highlighted the dialogue sessions and Luke's training program, portraying the center as a beacon of hope in a city scarred by division. A journalist interviewed Ethan on camera. "Judge Carter, what do you hope to achieve with this center?" Ethan's response was simple but powerful. "Reform, trust, change. This isn't about one side winning. It's about finding a way forward together." The media coverage brought new donations and volunteers to the center, further solidifying its role as a cornerstone for reform. Despite the progress, not everyone was convinced. Some officers continued to resist the reforms, and a vocal minority in the community doubted the sincerity of the police. Ethan and Luke knew the journey was far from over. One evening, as they reviewed the week's progress, Luke spoke up. "We've come a long way, but the pushback isn't going to stop." Ethan nodded. "True change never comes easy. But the fact that we're still here, still fighting, that's what matters." With momentum growing, Ethan and Luke prepared to take their reform efforts to the next level, determined to turn their city into a model for change nationwide. The Carter Harris Community Center buzzed with life as the celebration began. The large auditorium was filled with a diverse crowd: police officers, community members, local leaders, and families. Banners adorned the walls with words like "justice and unity," and "building bridges, not walls." On the main stage, Ethan Carter and Luke Harris stood side by side, their contrasting journeys converging in this moment of triumph. Ethan stepped forward first, his voice steady and deliberate, as he addressed the crowd. "This center isn't just a building," he said, pausing to let the weight of his words sink in. "It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we refuse to let fear and anger divide us. Together, we've shown that change is possible." The crowd erupted in applause. Then Luke approached the microphone. He hesitated for a moment, scanning the audience. His gaze landed on his wife, Chloe, and daughter Maggie, who smiled encouragingly. "I'm not proud of the mistakes I've made," Luke began, his voice raw. "But I am proud to stand here today and make a promise. A promise that every person in this community deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. And a promise that those who wear the badge will serve with honor, not arrogance." The applause this time was deafening, and the crowd rose to their feet as Ethan and Luke picked up oversized scissors to cut the ceremonial ribbon. With a single snip, the new training wing of the center was officially open, signaling a new era of reform. As part of the ceremony, a large tarp was pulled away to reveal a striking mural on one of the center's outer walls. The artwork, designed by Noah and Maggie, depicted Ethan and Luke shaking hands beneath the words, "Justice and Unity." The mural showed people from all walks of life: officers, students, parents, and elders, standing together. It was vibrant, hopeful, and powerful. Noah and Maggie stood beside the mural, beaming with pride as the crowd admired their work. A journalist approached them for a comment. "Maggie," the reporter asked, "what does this mural mean to you?" Maggie took a deep breath and smiled. "It means that no matter how broken things seem, we can always rebuild. People can change, and communities can heal, if we're willing to try." Nearby, Sophia Carter and Chloe Harris stood together, watching their children interact with the younger kids who had come for a tour of the center. "They've really grown up through all of this," Sophia said, her voice tinged with emotion. "They have," Chloe agreed. "And to think a few months ago, I didn't even think we could be in the same room together." Sophia chuckled softly. "Neither did I. But here we are. I guess if they can forgive, so can we." Chloe extended her hand and Sophia shook it warmly. As the event wound down, Ethan and Luke stood outside the center, watching the crowd slowly disperse. The late afternoon sunlight bathed the building in a golden glow, as if nature itself was acknowledging the significance of the moment. Ethan glanced at his wife and son, who were laughing with Chloe and Maggie. He turned to Luke and said, "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Luke nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I didn't think it was possible, not after everything I'd done. But you believed in this, even when I couldn't." "You didn't make it easy," Ethan said with a wry smile. Luke chuckled. I guess I didn't, but I'm grateful you didn't give up on me. On any of us. Ethan placed a hand on Luke's shoulder. We're not done. There's still a lot to fix. But this is a good start. As the families regrouped, Noah and Maggie gathered the younger kids for one final activity. Writing their hopes for the future on colorful paper leaves, which they attached to a tree sculpture inside the center. One boy wrote, "I hope we can all be friends." A girl added, "I want my dad to come home safe every night." Maggie looked at Noah and said quietly, "This is what it's all about, isn't it?" Noah nodded. "Yeah. Giving people a reason to believe things can get better." As the sun sets over the Carter Harris Community Center, its mural standing as a testament to hope and unity, one thing is clear. Change begins with those bold enough to take the first step. Ethan and Luke's journey proves that even the deepest divides can be bridged through courage, accountability, and a commitment to do better, not just for ourselves, but for future generations. What about you? What steps can we take in our own communities to build trust and create a better future? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who might need this message of hope, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that ignite change. Together, we can make a difference.